Hi! Welcome to this part of my review featuring the Goblin Slayer TRPG. If you haven't seen the other parts of my review featuring this role-playing game based on the popular fantasy series, please check out the playlist in the description below. This time, I am going to continue with the checks, specifically spell use related checks and miscellaneous combat maneuvers or tactics checks. We start with the spell use check. This is an intelligence focus or psych focus plus level of a spellcasting class plus modifiers from spell related skills such as spell expertise. The class and basic score to use for the spell is determined by the spell system of the spell being used. So for example, if you are playing a character with a level of sorcerer and you are casting sorcerer spells, you're going to be using intelligence focus plus the level of the class plus modifiers for your check. But if you are playing as a dragon priest who bases his or her spells on ancestral dragon arts, it's going to be psych focus plus the level of the class and the modifiers. With this check, you use a spell and resolve its effects. It's as simple as that. A spell use check will fail if the final check score is not equal to or greater than the difficulty of the spell that was used. If it fails, the spell does not activate and none of its effects are produced. If the final check score is equal to or greater than the difficulty of the spell that was used, the target or targets of the spell choose whether to resist the spell's effects or not. When resisting, you compare check scores, that is, the final check score of your spell use check against the opponent's spell resistance check. If you roll a critical success on a spell use check, then the opponent cannot evade any effects of the spell unless they roll a critical success on their spell resistance check. If the opponent fails their spell resistance check, they suffer the full effects of the spell. If the spell use check was a critical success, don't forget to add a +5 bonus to the final check score. The spell's effects will also change based on the effectiveness score, which is derived from the final score of the spell use check. It's useful to refer to each individual spell's effects section for the ways in which it changes. If the final score for the spell use check is lower than the difficulty of the spell that was used, the spell fails to activate. If the spell does activate, but you lose the check score comparison with the opponent's spell resistance check, they may fully resist the spell. Its effects will dissipate, or only some of its effects will be produced. For more information, you need to refer to the individual spell description. Now let's talk about the spell maintenance check. This is intelligence endurance or psych endurance, again depending on the spell, plus the level of the spellcasting class, plus modifiers. This check is used to focus your mind in order to use a spell, or to maintain an in-use spell's effects, and the target score is the difficulty of the spell being used, +5. This check is not going to be used all the time. This is when you have an ongoing effect. You need to see if you can keep on going with this spell effect. Then we have the spell resistance check. This is psych reflex plus the adventurer level plus modifiers from spell resistance. Now it is important to note that this is the adventurer level, the level in total, not the class level related to the check. You attempt to resist the effects of a spell that will have a negative effect on you. During a spell resistance check, you compare check scores, that is, your spell resistance check against the opponent's spell use check. You cannot avoid the effects of a spell that had a critical success spell use check unless you roll a critical success on your spell resistance check. If the final score of your spell resistance check is equal to or greater than the final score of the spell use check, you resist the spell. When this happens, the spell's effects could be reduced or dissipate entirely. Then we have the Provoke Check. This is not related to magic. This is Psych Reflex plus Fighter or Monk level, plus the bonus from Provoke. You provoke an enemy to draw their attention and their attacks away from an ally. The Provoke skill is required to perform this check. During a Provoke check, you compare check scores, which are your Provoke check against the opponent's intelligence resistance check. If your Provoke check is a critical success, then as long as the opponent's intelligence resistance check isn't a critical success, they lose their reason and respond to the provocation. If the opponent fails their intelligence resistance check, they come under the effects of Provoke. Then we have the movement obstruction check. This is strength reflex plus fighter level plus bonus from Rampart. You block another character from trying to go past you within reach and hold them within reach as well. Alternatively, you can block another character who is within reach from trying to move to another place. Only one character may declare movement obstruction against a single opponent. If multiple characters could declare movement obstruction at once, they should decide who will perform this check. During a movement obstruction check, you compare check scores, that is, your movement obstruction check against their movement obstruction resistance check. At this time, for each allied character within reach, you gain a +2 bonus to your movement obstruction check. If the movement obstruction check is a critical success, then as long as the opponent's movement obstruction resistance check is not a critical success, their movement is halted. If the opponent fails their movement obstruction resistance check, you stop their movement and can hold them within reach. However, the opponent decides where inside that range they stop. If the opponent passes their movement obstruction resistance check, they complete their movement, going to where they'd originally planned. And then we have the movement obstruction resistance check itself. This is strength focus or technique focus, plus fighter or monk or scout level. You shake off any obstructions from other characters attempting to bar your way. Imagine forcefully pushing through when using strength focus as the basic score, or nimbly slipping by when using technique focus. During a movement obstruction resistance check, you compare check scores, that is, your movement obstruction resistance check against the opponent's movement obstruction check. For each allied character within reach, you gain a +2 bonus to your movement obstruction resistance check. If the opponent's movement obstruction check is a critical success, then unless your movement obstruction resistance check is a critical success, your movement is stopped. However, you decide where in the opponent's reach you stop. If the final score of your movement obstruction resistance check is higher than the final score of their movement obstruction check, you break through or slip by the opponent's movement obstruction and end your movement where you'd originally planned. And this concludes this part of the review. In the next part, we are going to talk about many more miscellaneous checks related to situations outside of combat even. I like how this role-playing game feels a bit like an MMO. You have those roles of tank and the caster behind the tank, of course, but because of Provoke and these checks to stop the opponent's movement, it feels as if you are actually holding the line in those video game situations. However, because this is a tabletop role-playing game, this could be used or could apply in all sorts of situations that you normally wouldn't be able to handle in a video game. And remember that the enemies are also going to be using these checks against the player characters. So if you want to break through or reach an important enemy, instead of handling things in a more simulationist sort of way, this is a bit more abstract, making those checks to see if you managed to break through or push through and make your way to your target or to some other area in the battlefield. In the case of spellcasting, it's also quite simple. It's just a check like all of the other actions, but there is a bit more nuance when you are maintaining a spell, as mentioned. In that case, you will have to make those checks to see if you can keep those ongoing magical effects up. Thank you for watching this part of the review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And thank you so much to those of you that have been supporting the channel by sending drive-thru RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you, and see you later.